Hello, and welcome to Playing It Safe, a podcast for parents and coaches who want to protect children in sport without panic, blame, or second guessing. Today, we're talking about something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and that discomfort is part of the reason it's so often misunderstood. We're talking about child exploitation in sport, and what that phrase actually means beyond the headlines, beyond the worst-case stories, and beyond the situations most people assume it only applies to. Because when people hear the words child exploitation in sport, their minds tend to jump straight to extremes, scandals, criminal cases, situations that feel shocking and distant, things that happen somewhere else, to someone else, in environments that look nothing like their child's club or team. And because of that, exploitation becomes something people believe they would recognize immediately. Something obvious, something dramatic, something that would never quietly develop in plain sight. But exploitation in sport doesn't usually begin with obvious harm. It begins with imbalance, with pressure, with expectation, with children slowly being taught that their needs matter less than their potential, their well-being less than their performance, their comfort less than the opportunity in front of them. That's why it's so important to talk about what exploitation actually looks like in everyday sporting environments, because if we only define it by its most extreme outcomes, we miss all the earlier stages where prevention is still possible. Exploitation in sport isn't just about abuse in the legal sense. It's about when a child's involvement in sport starts to benefit adults, systems, or outcomes more than it benefits the child themselves, and that can happen without anyone setting out to cause harm. Sport is built around development, progression, talent identification, pathways. Those things aren't inherently bad. In fact, they're often what motivate children and give them confidence. But when development becomes the priority at the expense of well-being, the balance shifts. And that's where exploitation can begin to take shape. Children in sport are taught very early that success comes with conditions: train harder, commit more, sacrifice more, be available, be resilient, be grateful. These messages are often framed as preparation for the real world. But for children, they can blur important boundaries. Children don't always know when something has crossed a line. They know when they're tired, anxious, or unhappy, but they don't always connect those feelings to exploitation, especially when adults around them frame pressure as opportunity. One of the reasons exploitation in sport is so hard to talk about is because it doesn't always involve clear wrongdoing. It often involves systems and expectations that are socially accepted, even praised. Long training hours, playing through injury, being singled out for extra attention, being told this is what it takes. In many sporting environments, sacrifice is normalised. Children are praised for giving everything, for pushing through pain, for prioritising sport over rest, social life, and sometimes even education. When that sacrifice is voluntary and balanced, it can be part of healthy development. But when it's expected, pressured, or emotionally enforced, it becomes something else. Exploitation often hides behind the idea of choice. Adults say things like, "they don't have to do it," or "no one's forcing them." But children experience choice very differently to adults. When a child's identity, friendships, and future hopes are tied to sport, saying no doesn't feel like a real option. Children want approval. They want to belong. They want to be seen as committed, and they learn quickly that compliance is rewarded. That pushing back can be interpreted as a lack of dedication. That questioning expectations might cost them opportunities. That's not because children are weak, it's because they are children. Another reason exploitation is missed is because it often happens gradually. There's rarely a single moment where everything changes. It's incremental. Training increases, expectations rise, rest decreases, pressure becomes normal. And because each step feels small, no one notices when the balance tips. Parents can feel this tension deeply. They want to support their child's passion. They don't want to be the reason opportunities are missed. They're told this level of commitment is normal for talented children. And without clear reference points, it's hard to know where healthy challenge ends and exploitation begins. Coaches may not see themselves as exploiting children. Many genuinely believe they're helping them succeed, but systems that reward results and progression can unintentionally encourage behaviour that prioritizes output over well-being. When success is measured narrowly, the child can become a means to an end rather than the focus of the process. Exploitation in sport isn't always about individuals acting with bad intent. Often, it's about environments that don't stop to ask whether what they're asking of children is reasonable, sustainable, or safe. And because exploitation doesn't always look like harm at first, it's easy to dismiss concerns. Children are tired because they're training hard. They're anxious because competition is stressful. They're upset because sport is demanding. All of those explanations can be true, but they can also mask something deeper. One of the most important things to understand is that exploitation isn't defined by outcomes alone. A child can be successful and still be exploited. A child can progress and still be ocloyed. Achievement does not cancel our well-being. When we only look at results, we miss the cost at which those results are achieved. This is why exploitation in sport is so often minimized, because the system points to success as proof that everything is fine. Medals, selection, advancement. Those become evidence that the process must be working, but safeguarding asks a different question. It asks how the child feels within that process. Exploitation thrives in silence. It thrives when children don't feel able to say they're struggling, when parents don't feel able to question expectations, when coaches don't feel supported to reflect on the pressures they're placing on young people. And it thrives when everyone tells themselves that because nothing extreme is happening, nothing needs to change. But exploitation doesn't start at the extreme end. It starts much earlier in everyday decisions, expectations and assumptions about what children should tolerate in the name of sport. One of the biggest misunderstandings around child exploitation in sport is the belief that it only applies when there is clear abuse or criminal behaviour. In reality, exploitation often exists in spaces that are entirely legal, socially accepted, and even celebrated. That's what makes it so difficult to recognise and talk about honestly. Exploitation, at its core, is about imbalance. It's about when the demands placed on a child consistently outweigh what the child is getting back in terms of enjoyment, safety, rest, and choice. It's about when adults, systems, or ambitions benefit more from a child's participation than the child does themselves. Sport is particularly vulnerable to this because it is outcome-focused. Progress, selection, performance, results. These things matter and are not wrong in themselves. But when success becomes the primary lens through which everything is judged, children can quietly become resources rather than people. Children in sport are often praised for being mature, dedicated, and resilient. Those traits are seen as positives. But sometimes what's being praised is actually compliance, the ability to cope quietly, the ability to push discomfort aside, the ability to prioritize expectations over needs. That's where exploitation can hide. A child who never complains might be seen as strong, when in reality they don't feel safe enough to speak. A child who trains constantly might be seen as committed, when in reality they feel pressure to perform to keep adults happy. A child who plays through injury might be seen as brave, when in reality they fear losing their place. These situations don't always involve someone deliberately taking advantage of a child. Often they involve adults not stopping to ask whether what's being asked is reasonable or whether the child truly has the freedom to say no. The idea of consent is complicated in sport. Children cannot consent in the same way adults can. Even when they appear enthusiastic, that enthusiasm exists within a context of power, expectation, and dependency. Children rely on adults for opportunity, approval, and progression. That reliance limits how freely they can refuse. When adults say, "They chose this," it's worth asking how free that choice really is. Exploitation also shows up in how children's time is treated. Long hours, constant availability, expectations that sport comes before school, family time, rest, or friendships. When children's schedules are shaped entirely around sport, their world can shrink. Their identity can narrow, and stepping back can start to feel impossible. Parents often struggle here. They don't want to deny their child opportunities. They're told that early commitment is necessary to succeed. They see other children doing the same. And without clear guidance, it's easy to assume this is just how things work. But exploitation isn't about comparison. It's about impact. A child who is thriving, enjoying themselves, and able to balance sport with other aspects of life is very different from a child who feels constant pressure, exhaustion, or anxiety. Two children can be doing the same amount of training and experience it very differently. That's why exploitation can't be defined by numbers alone. It's not just about how many hours a child trains or how many matches they play. It's about whether they feel supported, listened to, and able to step back without fear. Another reason exploitation is missed is because sport often celebrates sacrifice. Giving things up is seen as proof of commitment. Missing parties, Missing holidays, missing downtime. For older children, this might sometimes be a conscious choice. But for younger children, it's often shaped by adult expectations. When sacrifice becomes the norm rather than the exception, children can lose the ability to recognize when something is too much. Exploitation also thrives in cultures where questioning is discouraged. Parents may feel they shouldn't interfere, children may feel they shouldn't complain, coaches may feel they shouldn't challenge systems above them. Silence becomes a survival strategy, and because exploitation doesn't always lead to immediate harm, it can be rationalized. Children are coping. They're still turning up, they're still performing, so it must be fine. But coping isn't the same as thriving. Another overlooked aspect of exploitation in sport is emotional labor. Children are often expected to manage adult emotions, to stay positive, to accept criticism, to handle disappointment without showing distress, to be grateful for opportunities even when they're struggling. When children feel responsible for keeping adults happy, the balance of care has shifted in the wrong direction. Exploitation can also appear in how injuries and well-being are handled, playing through pain, minimizing discomfort, encouraging children to ignore signals from their bodies. These messages teach children that their physical and emotional boundaries are negotiable. Again, not always out of malice, often out of habit, culture, or misunderstanding. But the impact is the same. Children learn that their worth is linked to output, that their needs are secondary, that success requires endurance at any cost. That's not development, that's extraction. The reason this matters is because children carry these lessons with them. They learn how relationships work, how authority works, how much space they're allowed to take up. Sport is one of the most powerful learning environments in a child's life. It teaches far more than technical skills. If sport teaches children that their well-being is optional, that lesson doesn't stay on the pitch. So when we talk about child exploitation in sport, we're not just talking about worst-case scenarios. We're talking about everyday environments that slowly normalize imbalance, pressure, and silence. Understanding that doesn't mean condemning sport. It means taking responsibility for how it's run. And that's where the opportunity for change lies. So if exploitation in sport isn't always obvious, and it isn't always intentional, what actually stops it from happening? The answer isn't banning ambition or removing challenge, it's restoring balance. It's making sure that the child remains the central priority, not the pathway, not the results, not the reputation of the program, and not the expectations of adults. Exploitation thrives when systems stop asking reflective questions. Questions like, who benefits most from this level of commitment? Who feels able to say no? Who carries the emotional cost when expectations aren't met? When those questions aren't asked, children quietly absorb pressure that was never meant to be theirs. One of the most effective protections against exploitation is creating environments where children are allowed to be inconsistent, where they're allowed to have off days, where they're allowed to feel tired, frustrated, or unsure without those feelings being treated as weakness. Sport should stretch children, but it should not consume them. Adults play a huge role in setting that tone. Children take their cues from how adults talk about effort, success, and failure. If praise is only ever linked to sacrifice and output, children learn that rest and balance are liabilities. If adults openly value well-being, reflection, and choice, children learn that their needs matter. Exploitation often continues because no one wants to be the first person to question what's happening. Parents worry they'll be labelled difficult. Coaches worry they'll be seen as soft. Children worry they'll lose opportunities. Everyone is protecting something, but in doing so, the child ends up carrying the weight. Breaking that cycle requires normalizing conversation. Not dramatic confrontation, but calm discussion. Not accusation, but curiosity. Not waiting until something goes wrong, but checking in while things still look fine. Parents need permission to ask questions like, is this level of commitment still right for my child? Coaches need permission to reflect on whether expectations have crept too high. Clubs need permission to step back from one-size-fits-all models of development. Exploitation is less likely to take root in environments where adults talk openly about pressure, where they acknowledge that ambition can sometimes drift into excess, where they recognize that children don't all experience challenge in the same way. Another important protection is helping children develop language around their experiences. Children need to know that feeling overwhelmed doesn't mean they're failing, that wanting rest doesn't mean they lack commitment, that speaking up doesn't make them ungrateful. When children are taught that their feelings are valid, exploitation loses its power. Silence is one of the main conditions exploitation depends on. Giving children language disrupts that silence. It's also important to recognize that exploitation isn't always driven by one adult. Often it's driven by systems, by competition structures, by selection processes, by funding models, by cultural expectations about what success looks like. That means preventing exploitation isn't about removing individuals. It's about changing norms. That change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with awareness, with adults being willing to look honestly at environments they care about and ask whether children are being supported as whole people, not just performers. For parents listening to this, there are a few things worth taking away and holding on to. First, pay attention to balance. Not just how often your child trains, but how they recover, how they talk about sport, how it fits alongside school, friendships, and family life. Balance looks different for every child, but chronic exhaustion, anxiety, or loss of enjoyment are signals worth taking seriously. Second, notice whether your child feels able to say no. Can they step back from training when they're tired or injured without fear? Can they express doubt or discomfort without feeling they'll disappoint someone? A child who feels trapped by expectations is at greater risk of exploitation. Third, listen for language that suggests pressure has become internalized. Phrases like "I can't miss this," "I'll let them down," or "I have to push through" can sound like commitment, but they can also signal that responsibility has shifted onto the child. Fourth, remember that success doesn't cancel out harm. A child can be progressing and still struggling. Achievement doesn't mean everything is fine. Well-being and success are not opposites, but one should never be used to excuse the absence of the other. And finally, trust that asking questions is part of protecting your child, not holding them back. Healthy sporting environments welcome reflection. They don't rely on silence to function. Child exploitation in sport isn't always about shocking stories or criminal cases. More often, it's about slow shifts in balance that go unnoticed because they've been normalised. Understanding that doesn't mean rejecting sport. It means taking responsibility for how sport shapes children's lives. When adults are willing to slow down, reflect, and put children back at the centre of decision-making, exploitation loses the conditions it needs to grow. Sport has the potential to be a powerful, positive force. It can build confidence, resilience, and joy. Protecting children from exploitation isn't about limiting that potential. It's about making sure it doesn't come at a cost children were never meant to pay. If this episode has helped you see child exploitation in sport more clearly, subscribing means you won't miss future conversations like this, and it helps Playing It Safe reach other parents and coaches who want to keep children safe without panic or blame.